Živijo, jaz sem Boštjan Ahbar in to je podcast Podrobnosti. To je danes epizoda številka 41. Na drugi strani linije iz Ljubljane pa komentator slovenskih vedeževalskih oddaj Anže Tomič.
Sorry, nisem vedel, da si to rekel. Še tako je kakšen komentator. Ja, živa bohe. Okay.
Internetni oziroma twitteraški komentator.
Ja, jaz ne vem, to lahko služba obstaja za to. To je bilo epsko.
Če ni do zdaj, pa zdaj obstaja.
Ja, zdaj obstaja.
Nekdo bi te mogel plačati dejansko za tvojo...
Zdaj moraš razložiti ljudem, kaj govoriš.
Tako ne. Slovenska, a rečemo neimenovana TV mreža.
Ne, povej, kaj
okay. Ne, to bo jaz, kaj, ker ne vem točno, da ne bom narobe rekel.
Net TV je.
Net TV, ima kaj, vsako četrtek, kaj vsak...
Ja, v bistvu tale trenutek se odvija. Začne se po 9:30 se začne.
Aha.
Je oddaja Vaša osoda z vedeževalcem Blažem.
Tako, to je oddaja, katere nedvomno je velik fan Anže Tomič.
Res je.
Zdaj kak fan, pustimo zdaj to, ne? Ampak dejansko, če imaš čas, se usedeš pred TV in to pogledaš. A je to res?
Res je. Pa ob četrtkih ponovadi nisem imel treninga, tako da sem doskrat po nesreč zasledil.
Aha. Ja, ne, tako da s te strani sem ti zelo favš, ker res nimam Net TV, ni satelitski program, ni internetni program, čeprav Net TV bi skoraj da lahko bil internetni program, ampak pustimo to.
Ja.
Glavno, vedeževalec Blaž, ki je zanimiv, ne?
Ja, mislim, realno gledanje je to grozen, kar te ljudje počnejo. Se ne samo on, veš, pač tako.
Ja.
Ampak,
ima jih.
Tako. Ampak način, na katerega on to počne, je zanimiv. Tako da ne bom še enkrat rekel, če kdo tega ni videl, Net TV vsak četrtek, mislim, da je 20:25, oziroma ne 21:25. Tako je.
Ja. Pa komod tweetate Anžetu, ker obstaja velika možnost, da on takrat gleda in komentira to.
Če boste to videli, ko začnemo uporabljati hashtag Vaša osoda. Tako.
Vaša osoda je ta hashtag, ja.
Drugač pa ful hvala vsem, ki ste sledili tweetom in mojim in od Bokija, pa Tamari, ki je Boki omogočila gledanje z periskopom.
Ja, sem res, hvala lepa, se priporočam za kaj takega. Čeprav parih je pa potem par teh, ko so se vključili v debate, je pa dalo link naprej od vidovitega Milana. Tega poznaš?
Ja, on je pa itak že...
Ta gre pa ono, he takes it up another notch, veš, raises the level.
Ja, mislim, Milan je boljši, to je treba povedati.
Mislim, je drug nivo, ne. Prej sem šel gledati malo te link, malo preden smo začeli snemati, sem malo pogledal par teh posnetkov. Ne vem, če si tega videl, ampak dejansko v enem od teh mnogih YouTube posnetkov minutnih je eno poslušalcu rekel, ki je imel težave z zdravjem in ga materala prebava, naj si utakne prst v ta zadnjo in gleda v poster Snoop Dogga. Dvakrat na teden po 1 uro naj to naredi, pa bo rešen težav.
To je vidoviti Milan, tako je življenje. On je kralj, on je kar kralj.
V glavnem... Čak tisti angela že imaš, kaj je že angel, kako se reče?
Kako je že, angel sode?
Angel sode, ali kaj je že, ki je zadnjič Blaž prodajal.
Glavnem,
ki ima čas za...
Zdaj, ljudje, ki niste to gledali, vem, da vam ni noč jasno, bom dal link tudi v zapiske. Unetvite Vaša osoda, pa link do vedeževalca Blaža, da te videli točno, o čem govorimo.
Enostavno je bilo toliko debate tudi v zadnjem tednu, da smo rekli, da ima danes podcast odpred z debato o...
Ja, če ne bi delala krivica vsem.
Tako, predvsem pa Blažu. V glavnem... pa še nekaj, bilo je kar nekaj requestov, da bi Blaža povabili na podrobnosti.
Dajmo reči, da delamo na temo.
Okay,
to res ali ne, ni važno, ampak dajmo reči, da delamo na temo.
Case closed. V glavnem, v prejšnji epizodi smo se pogovarjali z Jako Lakovičem, dolgoletnim slovenskim košarkarskim reprezentantom, moj dober prijatelj in legenda slovenskega basketa, Jale nacionale za nekatere, ki je bil pripravljen na eno tako res fajn debato o karieri, o izkušnjah, anekdote, tudi o prihodnosti, njegove načrte in tako naprej. Tako da tisti, ki niste poslušali, 40. zadnja epizoda je tista, v kateri smo se pogovarjali z Jako in še enkrat hvala Jaki. Ogromno je bilo spet odzivov. Pa jaz vedno rečem, tisti ljudje, ki bom rekel, nama pišejo, da delamo super podcast, jaz vedno rečem, brez najnih gostov ne bilo to, kar je. Tako da, Jaka je še eno vrsti od teh mnogih, ki so res popestrili ta podcast podrobnosti. Tako da, thanks. Drugač pa admin zadeve.
Ta podcast najdete na aparatus.si. Smo tudi v iTunesih, tako da nam dajte tam kakšno oceno. Zdaj je tudi naš Twitter account s Sužnom.
Sužen strokovnjak, izvedno je strokovnjak, ker je le strokovnjak, ker zna.
Dobro si me popravil, se opravičujem, Sužen strokovnjak, tako da afna podrobnosti _si. Smo na Twitterju, drugač pa lahko aparatus tudi podprete, to pa naredite tako, da greste na aparatus.si/podpri.
Tudi v mojem imenu, full thanks vsi tisti, ki poslušate in pomagate, da ta podcast mreža in ta podcast podrobnosti še naprej lepo raste. Pa hkrati bi mogoče tisti, ki ste bolj košarkarsko usmerjeni, pa imate otroke, pa to poslušate, jaz upam, da ne preveč otrok poslušate naš podcast, včasih znamo malo biti taki, explicit. To smo dali na iTunes, sem strajal, da se da zraven tisti explicit znake, čeprav ti nisi največji fan tega, ampak ajde. Jaz se moram malo bolj paziti, veš.
Res je.
Tako da tisti, ki pa nimate še mogoče poletnih načrtov za svoje otroke, oziroma poznate koga, ki je nadušen od košarko, ki ima rad košarko, vabljeni na moj košarkarski kamp, oziroma naš košarkarski kamp v Kopru, ki bo od 19. do 26. julija. Več informacij pa na bokinahvar.net, tako da ne bom predolg. To je to. Danes pa nas čaka podcast z ameriškim političnim komentatorjem, zgodovinarjem in podcasterjem, to je Dan Carlin, ki ima mogoče svetovno enega najbolj znanih zgodovinskih podcastov, ki se imenuje Hardcore History. Ali se strinjaš s tem? Poznaš kak drugi zgodovinski podcast, ki je bolj hud kot ta?
Ne. Se strinjam.
Pa povem, da poznaš mnogo podcastov. Človek je na način, kako on pripoveduje, kako je se lotil tega podcasta čist amatersko in tako vsakako res vem, ga bomo poprašali. V bistvu je pripravil ta podcast na en tak nivo, da je to res prava učna ura. Dejansko požiram podcast za podcastom, nekoliko epizod sem se poslušal o različnih temah, vse od prve, druge svetovne vojne, pa potem vse nazaj, Egipt, Rim, srednji vek, karkoli. V bistvu ima neverjetno dobro zbira teme, neverjetno dobro jih komentira. Tako da to je en podcast za vse tiste, ki imate radi zgodovino, tako kot imam jaz in kot imam že. Dejte pogledati ta podcast, imenuje se Hardcore History. Hkrati pa ustvarja tudi drug podcast, ki se imenuje Common Sense, ki pa je bolj tak političen in pa ki se bolj ubada z aktualnimi dogodki. Marsikoga tudi nekako odkrito skritizira, pa ne na nek tak direkt način, ampak pač poda svoje mnenje. Tudi tem ga bomo malo vprašali. Tako da Dan Carlin je en tak izkušen podcaster, ki ima neko težo v svetu podcastanja. Anže, se strinjaš?
Se strinjam. Mislim, lepo si povzel. Pač. Jaz da samo poslušam popko.
Se to. Mislim, da ne vem kaj preveč ali pa premalo rekel. Tako da. V glavnem, to je to. Dan je na West Coastu v Ameriki, z njim smo na liniji, tako da Anže, če si ready,
sem.
Štarti zadevo. As we said in the intro, Dan Carlin is with us. Dan, how you doing?
I'm well. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, thanks for taking your time. It's really cool to talk to you. Like I told you a minute ago, me and Ajay are both big fans of Hardcore History and Common Sense podcast. Both amazing podcasts that we would like to talk about in this talk that we're going to have. Really, for my first question would be, how did you start the podcast? How did you get into it? I mean, you were, if I'm not mistaken, you were a professional radio host before. But what got you into podcasting to start the podcast that you're doing now?
I was a professional radio show host, and while I was in radio got to be a not very fun place to work. There had been some legal changes, and there had used to be limits in the United States on how many radio stations a single owner could own. And generally it was like 8 or something like that. And then the law changed that pretty much took any cap off that number. So a couple of giant companies started buying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stations. And all of a sudden, you know, what used to be a pretty local operation where the boss who signed your paycheck was in the building with you turned into something where your station was one of 800 or 900 stations. And it just became a very, we'd say in the United States, homogenized, sort of vanilla, no diversity, no fun, no ability to be artistic. And so there were a lot of people in the early 2000s not very happy in radio. And I had for years had some of my listeners saying that the program that I did should be on the internet, even before there really was a mechanism for that. You know, very high-tech people who would say, oh, you know, we should put the show on the internet before there were podcasts. And I didn't know what they were talking about. And then all of a sudden, I ended up working with a company that I started with some other guys, and one of the things that they wanted to try to pioneer was online audio. And so I sort of became the test case, and we started a podcast then. And then I just I left that company not long afterwards. I took the podcast with me, and then I started the Hardcore History podcast after that. So that's kind of how it got started. And we've been doing it since 2005. It didn't seem like a long time, but people tell me today it's a long time ago.
Yeah, 2005 was. I lived in the States from 2002 to 2008, and I remember kind of just around 2005. Started to hear the word podcast, and I didn't know really what it was at first. That was kind of the time where the podcasting really started, right? 2005, 2004 is when it's kind of started, right?
Yeah, we certainly weren't the first, but we were in pretty early. And the biggest problem we had, you just said it, at the time was most people didn't even know what a podcast was back then.
Yeah.
Well, that's still the case now, really. Like, it's not...
I hope so. It means there's a lot of room for audience growth, right?
Yeah, that's why like everybody keeps saying. But like this year, there've been a couple of like really mainstream hits, like with Serial and all of that stuff. So yeah, I'm optimistic that it's taken off, I guess.
Well, I always feel like whenever a program like that, or I always used to say here in the States when ESPN's, the sports network, started podcasting, it meant that they would introduce a whole new bunch of people into how you get a podcast. And once you did that, they become a podcast listener that any of us could then exploit. So if Serial has increased the number of people who've discovered podcasting, I think that has an effect that helps all of us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
for sure.
That halo effect is always a welcome thing, basically.
Here in the States, we call it a trickle-down effect, maybe.
But then I always was wondering how do you record your podcasting? I mean, I'm guessing you do it in the studio. It's not like some of us who are basically doing it from home. Your setup is a little bit more professional, to say so, right? I mean, I'm guessing with so much material you have to go through and everything and prepare. I mean, am I wrong, or is it actually done in studio with some professionals helping you and so on and so on?
Oh, I have a home studio, so I do it here at home, and that's basically all. I mean, every radio show host I ever worked with wanted to work at home, out of the house. So right there, podcasting had one advantage over radio right away. I can do it in my pajamas if I want to. So okay. I don't think I could ever go back. I'm totally spoiled.
That's good. No, that's good to hear. And I just saw on the internet, I saw that you just won an award for the 11th Annual Podcast Awards. Your Hardcore History podcast won an award in education section. I'm pretty sure that those awards like that and people recognizing your podcast has to be even bigger motivation for you for the future to keep doing what you're doing and being like a proof that you're doing the right thing.
Well, boy, after 10 years, I hope so. That's a pretty big mistake if I managed to go 10 years down. But listen, the awards are great, but what lets you know that it's working out well is the audience and the reaction that they give us and the feedback that they give us. I always tell people that if you go back and listen to some of our earlier shows, especially the Hardcore History podcast, they sound a lot different than the current one, and that's really due to audience feedback. They help us figure out sort of what's working and what's not, and what we should do more of and what we shouldn't. And so what you have today is something I started, but something that the audience helped mold into what it is. So if it's starting to win some awards and whatnot, well, that's fantastic, but it's certainly nothing I did by myself. I had a lot of people in the audience helping to smooth the edges and figure out, the best way to approach things. So a little bit of a group effort there maybe, but I appreciate you noticing.
No, but how has that been since you started in radio? I also have a radio background, like the audience feedback. Like, how is it different when you're doing the podcast?
Well, I was always a problem in radio in that I got into radio and was lucky to get a job when I was really quite young. And I was a talk radio show host, and all of the other people on the station were much more about the age I am now, actually. And so in the United States, the talk radio show audience, I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but in the U.S., it's quite a bit older than a lot of media audiences. They used to say that if a person was 35 years old, that's a young talk radio show audience member. Uh-huh. But I was about 27 when I was doing it, and nobody wanted to hear a 27-year-old spout off about politics if they're older than you. And what's more, my views were a little bit, and they still are, a little edgy for some people, and it was always the younger people when I was on radio that liked my stuff the best. And what's been wonderful about moving to the podcast is that you don't get that age breakdown anymore. There are a lot of 20-year-olds and whatnot who listen to the show. Of course, now that I'm older, I can get older people listening too. But in radio, it was always quite an uphill struggle for me. I sometimes fought with the audience because we didn't get along sometimes. But so I kind of feel like I've found my niche here. This is a much better place for me than radio. Radio's a little too narrow for my views. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect sense. Yeah.
It's not very corporate. It's not a very corporate sort of viewpoint.
Well, yeah, it's sort of designed like that, right? The internet, I mean.
And again, that's why it seems to be a perfect fit, not just for me, but for a lot of other podcasters, is I think it's, you still have the corporate side on the internet. Obviously, all the podcasts done by the professional outlets are an example of that, but there's a space for the rest of us who didn't always fit very well in that mold.
Yeah, for sure,
yeah. For those listeners, and most of our listeners are from Slovenia, even though we do, like tonight, we do the podcast in English. We have a Slovenian audience mostly. For people who maybe don't know your podcast, can you maybe real quickly just describe your two podcasts, Hardcore History and Common Sense? I just like the fans to have a chance to, or the listeners to have a chance to hear from you what those two podcasts are about.
I'm hoping they don't think I didn't do enough about Slovenian influence in the First World War, so I'll probably get for that.
I was hoping there would be a little bit more of it. But
everybody felt the same way. If that
I know. I totally understand. We'll get into it a little bit later, but
fair enough. I thought I'd preempt that argument ahead of time. The one podcast we do that's on current events and sort of politics is very similar to what I used to do on the radio, and we call that Common Sense. And that sounds like a sort of a non-traditional political viewpoint. It's hard. I call my political views Martian because they don't really fit into anybody else's little box. And I'm lucky enough to have open-minded enough listeners so that they can put up with all my strange little ideas and theories and ways of looking at things. But that's the one about politics and current events, and it's a lot like a more older person's, because I'm an older person now, version of the radio shows I used to do. And then Hardcore History is a sort of a strange thing. It couldn't really exist outside of podcasting. It was actually my mother-in-law's idea. I used to tell these stories at the dinner table. I'm a history fanatic, and I was a history major in college, and so I'll often subject my poor family members to these horrific stories while we're eating or something. And I think maybe to get me to shut up one night, she said, well, why don't you talk about this on a podcast? And I remember telling her, because, you have to be a historian to talk about this stuff. If there's one thing someone with a basic degree in history knows, is that does not make you a historian. And she said to me, I didn't realize you had to be a historian to tell stories. And I thought to myself, that's actually a very good point. So the key, I thought, when we started doing these programs was never to pass myself off as a historian, just a guy who talks about it a lot. And I think originally we sort of modeled the show after the kind of conversations I would have with other history students. you would always talk about what ifs, what if Rome never fell, any of those kinds of fun little conversations. And I thought, well, you don't have to be a historian to have those kind of talks. And that was how I designed it. It grew over time into something much more complicated and in-depth and everything else. And hopefully I'm not stepping on a bunch of historians' toes. But I think you could call it a form of popular history. And the best feedback I get from listeners about it is that it interests them enough in the subject so that after they hear us sort of tease them with it, they go and they study more about it, which I heartily recommend. But so that's kind of how those two things developed, and I'm as surprised as anybody that they're working.
Well, yeah, but that's a great way of putting it. It's sort of complementary to basically reading a book, like a proper historical book, I think. That's how I see it, yeah. Yeah, but well, it's more because you have a flair to your speech, basically, that makes it like a hell of a lot more interesting if such some dry person read what you like what you talk about. That was a compliment, by the way. I really convoluted
one. It's a very
one,
long-winded appetizer. Right?
No, I do want to ask you something because the episodes I like the most is where you have that little disclaimer at the beginning where it's more recent history, like the Red Scare episode, I guess. In America,
remind me what I said. That was a
you sort of explain it like, I'm sorry if this offends anybody, but this is sort of recent history, so there's still a lot of like lingering like feelings with the audience, I guess, about stuff. And like, how do you decide where that cutoff point is? Like, what's actual, like, I don't know, I'm not going to say ancient history, but what's recent history and then everything before that? Like, where's the cutoff point for you?
You mean what is too recent for me to talk about?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah. Well, people have asked about Vietnam, for example. So that would be the 1960s to about 1975. And I've thought about that, and I don't know if that's too recent or not. I certainly don't feel comfortable, I don't think, getting into anything in the 1980s. We have talked about things in the 1960s before, so I guess that the cutoff point is probably somewhere between 1970 and 1980, maybe, although I'm not sure I'd be too comfortable with too much from the 1970s either. But I've never really thought about it that way, to be honest. I just know that if I'm putting that disclaimer on a show about something that was mostly happening in the 1950s, I think something in the 1980s, 1990s is certainly too recent. And I think partially because, not just because it's still sort of raw, if you're going to talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall or something, but because maybe we haven't had enough time for perspective to set in. I mean, there's a reason historians feel like you get a better look at things when you get farther away from them. You lose things, too, because that emotion is an important part of the story, and that sort of goes away the longer away you get from a story. But at the same time, I think you balance it out by the fact that you get a much bigger picture. Some of the propaganda begins to fade in the background. But even in this First World War show we just finished, I felt like there were still a lot of little areas where nerves might still be raw, people might still feel very passionate and connected to the ideas. So, but I mean, I think you have to be willing to step on a few toes if you're going to stray from. I mean, even ancient history. I did ancient history and got some people mad at me once because it conflicted sort of with the views of their particular ethnic group or what have you. So, I mean, I think it's impossible to not upset some people. But you're right. I do recall doing a few of those disclaimers, and I sort of think we'll probably do a few more in the future.
Oh, that's awesome, because those are my favorite, honestly. And every time you deal with America, like the Red Scare, the whole J. Edgar Hoover stuff, that was awesome. For somebody that's not from the States, to just hear like anybody from the States talk about those times in that way was just, that was amazing. So, yeah. That's why I ask, because it's kind of weird, because you really jump around a lot. Like, there's no really method to what you're going to cover next. Like, how do you choose, I guess?
Well, I think that's how you can absolutely tell I'm not a historian, because I think these days historians are so fantastic at specializing, and they'll spend many, many years learning everything there is to know about Carthaginian history. But that doesn't always make it easy for them to talk about something outside that specialty. I love to look at the big sorts of changes and maybe stuff that's impossible to really study and know well. It's just too big and amorphous. And as we jump around here, the only thing that these stories have in common is the people side of it. And one of the things I always try to understand myself, and so we do the shows around that, is, what are the people in these stories feeling or experiencing? And the first thing we have to understand is that there's no way to know. You can't even talk about it unless you throw that disclaimer out there, because it's absolutely true. Not only is it impossible to know because I don't know what it's like to be on an ancient battlefield with the Romans and the Carthaginians, but I don't come from those cultures either. I wasn't raised with those expectations. And these are people, but they're different people. And so you have to kind of understand, okay, there's no way we can get anywhere near those people. Now let's try anyway and see how little tiny little bits of things we can at least start to say, wow, isn't it amazing that they could do this or that they could endure that? I mean, the ability for humans to endure is one of those things that never ceases to amaze me, and that I think you see running through a lot of my history podcasts, my ability to just marvel at what human beings and our ancestors could do and live through.
Well, yeah, right. That's putting it mildly, basically.
Yeah. Then what is, if you could point out maybe one or two things, what is it about history that is so attractive to you? What attracts you to history the most?
I don't know the answer to that. I've been into it so long. My mom always joked that it must have come from a previous lifetime. But to be honest, I think it's the ability, and I think most people who are really interested in history have this ability, the ability to a little bit time travel in your head. If you can read a history book and look at the photographs in it and really get a good picture of that, I think that's something only about 10 or 20% of the people out there can do. And if you can do that, it makes you a very good audience member, for example, for history books, popular histories in the bookstore, the history channels and the TV shows and the movies. That appeals to a group of people. And I've always thought it's the people that can relate a little bit to stories from other periods and experiences from other times. I don't think anybody can do that, but I think if you go to most universities around the world and you walk into a history department at those universities, you're going to find a bunch of students who were born with that ability. And I think that's our audience. I think that's what makes me interested in the subject. And I think whenever we're not sure what to do on the shows, I always pick whatever interests me, and I tend to find that the 10 or 20% of people out there who can really sort of put themselves a little bit in the time machine and enjoy those stories a little bit more are the kinds of people that are going to think like I am. So I usually get a good response from listeners if I just go with what interests me. Those people who can put themselves a little bit, as much as you can, into the shoes of people who lived before us. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. And what did you through all the hardcore history podcasts you've done, from which podcast did you feel you got most feedback that was most interesting for the audience? Not the podcast itself, but the era you were talking about, the times you were talking about. Is there one that was sticking out more than the other?
Before this latest series, I tend to notice, and this is probably because the audience is increasing all the time. So right. With the First World War podcast we just finished up, the audience is quite a bit bigger than it was when we did the one on the Mongol era. But that was the one before this one I would have said most people could relate to. I think they're enjoying finding out this stuff, and I think the people, we hear from a lot of people on this First World War topic that know the topic very well already. And what they say is, I guess, that they find fun about it is we look at it a little differently. That's all. And it isn't anything, as a guy who's not a historian, I'm uncomfortable, and I wouldn't try to say that this view of things is right and that view of things is wrong. We try to bring multiple views of credible historians together and then say something like, well, this historian sees it this way, but that other historian sees it this way. Or this historian 50 years ago saw it one way. Nowadays, we look at it differently. And I think, if you want to say what surprised me about the history series, it's how interested the audience turned out to be about the fact that historians disagree about these things and how viewpoints change and how, one side of a viewpoint can write a history book that sounds one way, and another side can write it another. I didn't expect the audience to care that much about the nitty-gritty, the process of writing and arguing about history, but they've shown quite an interest in the subject. And again, hopefully you hope that they go and read some things on that after they hear the show.
Yeah, right. And you just mentioned the 6-part series about World War I, which you just finished. I think that it came out last week, or it was early this week. I'm not sure. The last part. I mean, this was a 1.5 long project, and just the last episode was over 4 hours long. After all this, the whole 6-part series and this 1.5 long project, do you still feel that there was a lot of things that were left unsaid from your part, from where you were, your standpoint, or did you think that six parts was just enough? It was enough time. It was enough episodes to basically wrap this whole World War I series into a one long podcast.
I think we barely scratched the surface. In 24 hours of audio, we barely scratched the surface. And I'm historically an awful topic picker, because I pick things that I think I'll be able to do so much more easily. And then once I pick them, and when it becomes too late to change my mind, I find out, it's a little like leaping off a cliff in the dark and not knowing how far it is to the bottom of the cliff. And I continually think it's going to be a lot closer than it is once I dive off the cliff. So 24 hours of audio, and I didn't include much on the Slovenes. I didn't include much. I didn't do anything on Africa. All these places that get left out of the story. And I think I said in the last show that the one thing doing these shows does for me is really gives me a lot of sympathy for all these historians who write these books and try to do these things. Because when I'm reading the books, I'll say things like, well, why didn't they talk more about this? Or why didn't they talk more about that? Now I know why they didn't, because you didn't want to have 500-page books, to have to go through. So barely scratched the surface would be my answer on that.
And how did you decide which World War I events to focus on? I mean, because there were just so many, and at the end of the day, you had to make a decision. Which one to point out, which one to spend some more time on it. How did you? I mean, was this purely because you were able to read more books on Ypres, for example, or on the what was going on in the Western Front, or it was just your decision at the end? Okay, I'll focus on that.
Well, when you're reading the accounts and you're trying to, first of all, I always pick subjects that I already know something about. There's no way for me to educate myself well enough in a short period of time to do these programs and sound like I even know a little bit about them. So all the reading that I do once I start is to try to upgrade what I already thought I knew. I mean, some of this stuff, the First World War I was deeply interested in, for example. I've always been, but I went through a phase in the middle 1980s where I was just a fanatic. But a lot has changed since the 1980s. So there's a lot of things you need to read to upgrade and update what you thought you knew. And then you sit down and you try to figure out, now, how am I going to build a story about this? What order am I going to tell things in, and what am I going to include, and what has to be cut out, and what do you have to have, and what can you do away with? And then mixed up with all that are these stories that are just, when I'm reading it, I always make notes at the things that blow my mind a little. And I always try to figure out how I can include that. So sometimes events get brought up that maybe are a little too small, but that story is just too good or says too much about human beings or whatever it might be to not include. And so once you add all those things together and you say, okay, here's my pile of things that might go into that show, you try to figure out, the problem. I had two problems with the First World War topic. One is that it's so huge. And very confusing. And the other problem that we had with the First World War show was that it's simply what's the best way to phrase this? The story is enormous, and the ability to differentiate the stuff that's going on. Like this last episode we did, the entire last year of the war, there's stuff happening all around, right? But the place where things are being decided are on the Western Front in these giant battles. And yet those giant battles go on for months and months and months and months. So how do you keep a story like that fresh for the listener, right? If it's the same kind of horrificness day in and day out, how do you tell that to people without them going, okay, I get it. It's the same thing day in and day out. And so sometimes we'll break it up. So in an earlier episode, we had this terrible battle that went on, and we told you about that. And then we did a little side detour, and we talked about naval technology. And a big naval battle that had happened during that period was our opportunity to change sort of the pace and the feel and the mood and go from the deep, dark horror of the soldiers in the trenches to something that was sort of technological. And we could talk about some other things. And then when we went back to the trenches after we did that, people were sort of refreshed. I described it as when you cleanse your palate with a little sorbet in a restaurant between meals, you know? You sort of, if you keep touching the same nerve on the listener over and over and over again, for example, in the case of the trenches, the horror nerve, it becomes numb and it doesn't work anymore. And so you have to figure out ways, and this is what you guys do too, it's what all of us do who do podcasts. You try to figure out, okay, what's the pacing of this have to be? What do I have to include? When do I need, if you're writing an opera or something, sometimes you need to build up the drama to some big crescendo, and then you need to take the audience down again. So there's an ebb and a flow and a rhythm. And so as you're trying to organize the events, you're trying to figure out how to change that. And the big challenge in the last show was that the events that really were deciding things were on the Western Front. They were drearily similar. They went on for months and months and months. So how do you make that interesting, keep it fresh, and not just drive people crazy? I mean, I imagine if I was in a country that did not get much attention from Dan Carlin, I would sit there and say, really? You're going to spend 2 hours on that Western Front thing at the expense of all these other interesting things? And it turns out, you know, one of the questions we ask ourselves all the time is what has to be in this story for people to understand? There's going to be a bare minimum. And that's when I had so much sympathy for all of these writers who concentrate so much on the Western Front, because you end up finding out this story doesn't even make any sense if you don't. But, you know, as we were doing that, you sort of realize that all the people that are being left out of the story, including the parts we didn't get to about the treaty afterwards and all that's remarkably important too. And that if you go, it's part of what made this story so hard is that there is so much written material in so many different countries on this, and yet not always the material you want. I mentioned in the last show, the people that really deserved more than anyone that got shortchanged in this series are the French. And part of and not because they didn't get attention from me, but because they're really one of the major players. But the number of sources in English where you have the remembrances of French soldiers is minuscule. And so in that sense, the fact that so many writers in English have spent so much time on conducting the British because they're the English-speaking people, and the Germans because they're the opponent of the English-speaking people, means that future people like myself fall into the same trap because that's where the source material is, right? So I didn't have anything in from any of the various Slavic peoples other than some stuff in Russian, for example, that we could draw on. So in a sense, we become victims to the material as well. I'm not sure in 24 hours of content if I could have slipped a lot more stuff in from Africa, for example. But I would have loved to have some firsthand sources so I had more of a choice in the matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. How are you on American?
I imagine you guys have lots of it, by the way. And correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, if I spoke your language or if I spoke French, are there lots of accounts from First World War veterans? Are there? Okay.
There
are. So I should have had a translator working with me.
Yeah, we did an hour with a historian on World War I. So yeah.
Yeah, Slovenian historian.
Yeah, Slovenian historian. So yeah.
Well, and I know you guys were in a key part of the. I mean, it's the major area where things kind of heated up to begin with, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean,
all
right.
Close.
And the battles of the Isonzo and all that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And you know, it was definitely the whole, you know, the current Slovenian-Italian border was a area of some really fierce fighting up in the mountains, up in the Alps.
Well, let me apologize for everybody listening for short.
Okay, so how do what do your notes look like? Because I just imagine like you're like Russell Crowe from The Beautiful Mind, and like how do your notes actually like physically look like? Because the amount of information you pack into every show, like how, like is it just a Word document, or how does that work?
What usually happens is it starts off pretty loose, and I'll go in and I'll start talking, and basically I talk until I sort of hit a wall, or until I run into a hang up, or the conversation just dies down, and then I'll send that chunk to my producer, who will put it together, and then the next day I'll come in and record some more, and they'll push it together. But as I'm doing it, I get more ideas, or a lot of times I'll end up, some book will arrive that wasn't here when I started, and so I'll start reading that, and I'll throw some new things in, and what happens is you start to get kind of confused as the process goes on. We even have a name for it. I call it the Blue Room, and the Blue Room happens when you can't listen to the show anymore with fresh ears, when you've heard not just the one you're doing 20 times, but multiple versions of it. You can't keep track of them anymore. They all overlap and blend together, and so then maybe I'll have another person listen to it and still say, now, does this even make sense anymore? And they'll say something like yes or no, and so by the time I'm halfway through this, now I'm starting to make notes. In this version, we did talk about the ships. In this version, we did not talk about the Battle of the Isonzo, because I'm mixing them up with previous versions. But I don't have like a rundown, or I don't have detailed notes. Although, if I find out tomorrow I'm going to talk about the Battle of Gallipoli, as I get ideas throughout the night, I might write stuff down so I don't forget them when I go in the booth tomorrow, or the studio tomorrow. So it's a very loosey-goosey process. Sometimes I've had to resort to note cards. Sometimes I do it off the top of my head. Usually there's just a lot of scribbled stuff everywhere. You look, little pieces of paper, and one time like a cover of like a menu I took from a restaurant. I mean, it's all... you could never figure it out if I let you go in there in an archaeological project to try to decide. It would just, there'd be coffee cups, pizza boxes, little things scribbled on the pizza box. It's very disorganized.
Okay, well, that's pretty much how I imagined it. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Well, it does when the complete package comes out. I have to say, it does come out as a very organized thing. I mean, it has a head and a tail, definitely.
Well, I think we've been very fortunate, and there's been a little bit of luck, too, so let's not discount that.
Okay. Then, if you could point out the most fascinating historic period, could you point out one? Is there one that it's your favorite,
There isn't one, and that's why I can jump around like this, because all these shows we do are all from things I like, and that's why I pick them. And so you can see how varied that becomes. I get more interested in incidents rather than periods. I'll give you an example of what I mean. One of my favorite incidents, and we used this in the show we did on the Assyrian Empire. That was a long time ago now. It was called Judgment at Nineveh. And it's more of one of our old style shows. The shows used to be a lot shorter and a lot less detailed, and we would just focus on more of the weird stuff rather than give you a narration of a story. And I started the piece off with one of my favorite pieces from ancient history, and it was written by the Greek soldier Xenophon, who was one of the people in the famous Retreat of the 10,000. It's one of those great Greek stories from the classical era of antiquity. And there's an incident in his account that's so fascinating to a modern person, because as these Greeks are fleeing the Persian army and running and fighting the whole way through Anatolia and all that, and northern Iraq, they come upon a giant, ruined, lost city. Giant, bigger than anything they could have found in Greece at the time. In other words, it's like a city a city that's of a higher technology than their own. This is something modern people can't relate to. We don't run into tech. You'd have to go to an alien world to have the same experience that Xenophon had. And he didn't know what the city was. He just knew that it was falling apart. I called it a ghost city in the show. But it wasn't a ghost city. It was an Assyrian city, 200, 300 years after the Assyrians fell. And neither this Greek person nor any of the locals that they asked questions about knew what this was. And I just found that so fascinating. I thought it was like the end of the Planet of the Apes movie where they find the Statue of Liberty sticking out of the sand. I thought, now that's a wonderful moment. So that's the kind of thing I would build the beginning of a show around, because I love that sort of an image. I love the images that play with the idea that we could still be subject to the cycles of history that other civilizations before us were subjected to. If you went to an ancient Roman in the height of Rome's fame and glory and said, is Rome ever going to fall? Is there ever going to be a time, when it's ruins and people are looking back on it? I think they would have thought that was crazy, probably. What if somebody said the same thing were going to happen to us? And if we're the only civilization that doesn't happen to, well, then we become the exception. I think it'd be very interesting to wonder about future archaeologists digging up our cemeteries and trying to figure out if they could decipher these computer codes. Do they need a Rosetta Stone to try to figure out Microsoft Word so they can read our documents, So I love those kind of ideas, and we kind of work those things into the show if they seem applicable to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that later. Like, what can we learn from history? Can history in a way predict our future? Simply because if we can look at past civilizations that were rising and falling, can we learn from history that could definitely happen to us too? And how could we avoid it and all that? Can history teach us that?
That's like the big argued about question all the time, even amongst historians. I was reading one of those magazines that these historical societies put forward, and they were having the discussion again. It was even greater than that. It wasn't whether history could predict the future. It was, does history teach us anything at all? Or is it just kind of just like watching a TV series, sort of, is it just interesting? And I was talking about that in some audio I recorded today for the other podcast we do, where we were kind of talking about, what can you see in the future by looking at the past? And what you can't tell, there's a famous thing we in America always have to listen to, and it gets involved in our political arguments, where they talk about Hitler. And they talk about the Munich Agreement, and they'll say that history teaches us, and this is not historians saying this, this is, people on radio talk shows and political shows and arguing politics. They'll say, well, what we learned from Munich is you can't appease dictators. And that's exactly the kind of thing history does not show you, because of the variables, right? Hitler is a variable. Just because Hitler behaves a certain way, does that mean Saddam Hussein is going to behave exactly the same way? No, because they're people and everybody is different. But sometimes you can see trends that look like they're leading towards something. So I was talking in this podcast I just recorded about the police shootings that have happened in this country, and we're having some political debate over African Americans who die in police custody. And I was pointing out that if something doesn't change, if things continue the way they are, you're going to see more of these riots that have started to break out. Now, there's no guarantee that things will continue the way they are, right? 9/11 in the United States, the terror attacks in New York, that's a perfect example about how the course that a place is on can change. But if you say, if things stay as they are, you can predict more demonstrations and riots in the future, I think that's the kind of thing history is not that bad at teaching. It's not foolproof because things do change and variables do come into play, and wild cards, you would call them in a card game, come up. But if you say, if things continue as they are, you are probably going to see this, and history shows that, I think those are pretty safe assumptions. I'm not sure I would go to Las Vegas and bet anything on it. but I've always found it to be a kind of a good guide when I'm trying to assess a situation. It's not foolproof, but it helps you weigh the odds a little bit. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Andrzej, you wanted to ask something about the artwork.
The artwork's awesome. I don't really have a question there. Just it's awesome. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you guys like it, because my wife hates it. My financial advisor hates it. I get a lot of, but I try to explain to them that I want it to look dark. and I want it to look kind of movie posterish, and I want, or like the old record albums I grew up with. I want it to grab you, and I want it to say something. And the guy who does the artwork, I think he deserves all the credit in the world. His name is Nick Lay. He's a Canadian, and he's been working with us since I think 2006. And it's taken that long for him to understand the way I think, because he can do all kinds of artwork. He had to figure out my style, and that's kind of becoming our trademark. And to me, he gets better and better. And I've had his art blown up sometimes, and there's all these little teeny ghostly things in the background that you can't even see when it's smaller sized. I mean, he puts a lot of added depth into it, and it's become one of the things I enjoy the most is seeing the artwork up there, because for the longest time we just used sort of a generic cover that was the same for everything. And he kind of talked me into, we always name the shows something, because I always felt a name rather than a number gives a show its own personality.
Yep.
And he said the same is true for the artwork. If you do the artwork right, the name and the artwork will give an individual personality to each one of these shows. And I have to say, he was right as heck, and I love the artwork. I'm like you. My wife hates it, but I love it. And it's too dark for her.
No, that's true, and especially like podcasts, like there's so many now, and like most of them don't really care about the artwork. So I really appreciate every podcast that sort of has it, like make sure the artwork is kind of awesome, and yours definitely is. So yeah, that wasn't really a question, but yeah, okay.
Well, but we figure if we're going to spend 24 hours on a topic, it probably ought to have a little of its own artwork.
Yeah. It should be more than somebody messing around in like MS Paint or something. Yeah,
you hope anyway.
That's true. Yeah.
Dan, when you were on Joe Rogan a while ago, I think your first appearance there, at the beginning of a conversation with him, you guys mentioned the History Channel and the Discovery Channel, all these documentary channels that we have nowadays that rarely really show the true historic shows. I mean, it's mostly reality TV, and I mean, what's your opinion about all these channels, about the TV that's pretending to have all the shows, the educational shows, but instead you see a lot of crap that basically doesn't teach you nothing. I mean, is that good for guys like you who's doing podcasting, open up more opportunities? I mean, that's just something that I talk to my friends a lot. You don't really find quality shows anymore on TV, and it's getting worse and worse. You go from all these reality shows about, I don't know, the truckers and the what do they call, the Iceland truckers or something like this, or the guys that are assembling cars, and it's all on History Channel. They're supposed to have history, not some reality TVs that are like pre-made. That it's not even a true reality TV.
Well, I mean, that's an issue, and I think it's an excellent question, and it's something I could talk far too long about. Mm-hmm. But I'll give you a few things. First of all, I have heard that some of those stations are changing course now, and I think they feel like they've hurt maybe what we say in the corporate world, their branding a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And so I have heard that maybe they're doubling back a little bit on some of that stuff. But for me, yes, absolutely, I feel like it's provided a wonderful space that we can occupy here that they sort of abandoned. But it's worth bringing up because, when we first were doing the history podcast early on, we used to say that when it comes, we're not an educational, we're not a university course, we're not, I'm not a historian. All we were trying to do was do something that was, our standards were to be more accurate than what was on television. And, the point is that that's not setting the bar very high. Yeah. I understand. But sometimes, and not very often, people are very gentle and very kind with me, I have to say. But now and again, I'll read on a place like Reddit or something where, there'll be some historian who's upset about us not being 1,000% accurate on this or violating some historical protocol for historians on that. And I always think to myself, do you say that to the History Channel? I mean, when they do show a history thing, because I'm just trying to be better than them. I'm not trying to do a course that's accurate by university standards. We just do our best. The reason I bring these stories up is to talk about human beings, really, and the things that make me interested about these situations, like that Assyrian ghost city I talked about earlier. And so I guess I don't want to be held to a higher standard than other popular histories. And so that's, I guess, it's almost maybe a compliment that that people like that are trying to hold us to a real educational standard. I mean, it's nice if they think we're good enough to be included in that class. But my goodness, we thought we were doing something more like a popular history. Now, the problem the History Channel always had, as I understand it, was, it's hard to do a good history program in Hollywood or New York without a lot of money. Because you really have to then have some very good writing to make up for things. Like I've talked to TV companies, and I don't get very far with them because we have different views on what's good. But one of the problems they always have is, what the heck do they use for pictures, right? So if I'm going to talk about any of the things I talk about in these podcasts, there are pictures for World War I. But if I'm talking about ancient Assyria and Xenophon and ghost cities, there's a limited number of things that they can show somebody. I can sort of paint a picture with my head. There's no sets. There's no computer graphics. There's, so I do think that the television people are hamstrung a little. That's why they used to get criticized for showing the same World War II footage over and over and over again. It's the footage they have, It's a little like the comment we made about not having more Slovenian firsthand accounts of Slovenian soldiers in the First World War in the English language, Sometimes you get stuck with what you have to work with.
Yeah, and even less probably video material.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody was hamstrung by that. And if you go back before the video period, then you're shooting tombs and hieroglyphics and modern, landscapes and maybe some computer graphics, or recreations. I hate recreations.
Oh, the worst. Just the worst.
And you know what? I'll tell you something. Every TV person who approached me said, "Don't worry, we do recreations differently," and they never do. They're always hokey. They always take a grand, really wonderful historical moment and cheapen it. There's just someday somebody will do it right, but I haven't seen it yet. And I wanted to experiment with some really edgy ideas. And the TV people looked at me and said, "That will never fly on this particular channel or that particular outlet." So maybe just a little too hardcore still for the TV channels.
No, for me, it just bothers me a lot. Like, in the evening, kids are asleep. Like I'm ready to watch a good TV show. I turn on TV, try to look through one of the historic channels. And then you see like Pawn Stars or Storage Wars or X-Men or, it just bothers me so much. So I had to bring it up and see your
I feel just the same way you do. We're in the same group. I feel just like you do.
Yeah. Then a few days ago, I saw that you didn't like the way your Wikipedia post is about you, about your political leanings. Did you want to comment on that? I saw you were going back and forth with a few people on Twitter. Is that something that bothered you, that Wikipedia was trying to label you one way or the other? Since your Common Sense podcast and so on and so on.
Yeah, imagine that Wikipedia got something wrong. That never happens. Yeah,
I'll tell you guys if I can make this story short, which I'm not sure I can. I'll tell you a funny story about the whole Wikipedia thing. And listen, we all know what Wikipedia is. It's not one person. Somebody goes up there and either maliciously or just thinks that they can describe what you think in a short little label. And so people
look at it like, if people want to look somebody up, they'll most of the time turn to Wikipedia. Right.
That's just where. So let me tell you this story. So about a year or two ago, I get invited, and I couldn't believe it. It's maybe the shock of my life to go give some outside the box ideas to United States Central Command, the Pentagon people who run the Middle East warfare and all that. They're coming out with a report. So they invited 11 or 12 people from outside the normal group of people that they talk to give them some ideas for this report. And I thought it was a hoax when they contacted me. I thought somebody was playing a trick on me because, they're going to call some podcaster who does a, political, but sure enough, they did. So I end up, long story short, in this group with some very big influential figures. and everybody has a folder that they give us, and it has the resumes of everybody else at the table. So I can see this august figure and this guy, and he went to this university and he teaches this. They're all just great resumes. For me, they had printed out the Wikipedia page on me, and that's all they had. And so all these other people are thinking, wow, this is a really interesting group of people at this table. And then they get to me, and it's the Wikipedia page, and it's not even right. And so I mean, that's when I guess I learned, okay, I might have to pay a little bit more attention to this, that it's not just a harmless little thing. And so, but I don't go there and alter it. I think that's kind of cheating. So when I saw this thing that I knew would upset a lot of Americans if they saw it, because it had said, I hope I remember this correctly, it said I was a libertarian conservative. But I'm not a libertarian conservative. And so I think libertarian conservatives would have gone there and said, yes, I knew Dan was one of us all the time. But everybody else would have said, oh, my God, I'm not going to listen to this guy. So if you're the same viewpoint as that, maybe it works. Maybe it was a libertarian conservative that thought that we would get along real well. And I must be this, I mean, that's how those things happen. But you're right. I didn't want everybody else going and reading something that wasn't true. But I don't go to Wikipedia and alter it. So essentially, I knew if I told the listeners, somebody in there would fix it.
Yeah, but Andrzej, maybe you're a techie dude. Like, who can go on Wikipedia? How do you fix if there's some entry?
No, there's a bunch of editors, so they have to work it out basically.
Okay,
that's right.
You need a citation from they have trusted sources, right? So it needs to be like your political leanings basically would have to be written on a page on a website that's a trusted source by Wikipedia standards. So then you could have like a citation, to that page where it says you're a blank, right? I think that's the only way to fight that. But like it's a convoluted system. Like it breaks down most of the time. So I think you got off easy.
Oh, I definitely. Can you imagine what they might have put on there? I agree with you.
Yeah. Then, what can we expect from hardcore history and common sense in the future? You have any long-term goals, or you just go like month by month, year by year? Like, what do you want to do with it in, let's say, 3, 4, 5 years from now?
Well, on the political podcast, the current events podcast, Common Sense, I'm running into problems because we're approaching 300 shows now, and when you've done 300 shows, how do you keep from continually repeating yourself? And how much should I worry about that? And part of what, and you guys are in podcasting too, all of us are inventing this medium. I mean, we think it's been around a while, but 50, 60 years from now, amateur audio content, for lack of a better name, we're going to look like this is the really early stages, and we're figuring it all out now. And when you've got a couple hundred shows under your belt, what should you do? In radio, you didn't worry about it. In radio, they used to say people are getting into their cars and out of their cars all the time, and you're getting new people and old people every 15 minutes. So if you talk about the same things, it's no big deal. But should we in podcasting say, well, I spoke about that 5 shows ago. That show is still on the internet to be downloaded, so I won't talk about that again? Or is that something you shouldn't worry about because people are new and listening for the first time, and you have old listeners who heard the old show, but new listeners who haven't? So I'm having a hard time trying to figure out that problem on the current events show. On the history show, I have tons of unexplored areas we can still have fun with. My problem is I'm trying to not always do epic, large, long, 24-hour series. I had just done a big one on the Mongols when we did the First World War one, and I normally I would have had a much longer break between the big shows, but we decided that the timing was so perfect, with the 100-year anniversary of the war, and we wanted to get a little bit of that good timing, but it meant that I did basically 2 of these epics almost back to back. So if you don't like the First World War or the Mongols, a whole lot of my free feed is First World War and Mongols right now. So I want to diversify the offerings a little bit, and I want to get a few more shows that are just single episodes. They might end up being 4 hours, but it'll be one episode, not 6 3 or 4 hour episodes. And so part of what I'm working out here is how do we dial down the level of amount in the show for a while? I don't mind those big long epics. I just want them to be unusual things. I don't want them to be the things we do every single time. So right now I'm trying to work on coming up with something that is less about a single occasion in history and something that is more about, you had mentioned the Radical Thoughts. Was it Radical Thoughts episode you'd mentioned? What was the Red Scare one?
Yeah. I think it's sort of a series, that, right?
Yeah. But it's not even that. It's not really a single event, though. It jumped around a lot, and that's what the next show I'm planning on. I don't have it picked out yet. I'm doing that right after I get off the phone with you. I'm working on that right now. But I haven't. I'll tell you what I'm thinking, just so you know. I'll give you guys a heads up. Don't hold me to this, because I'm sure I'll change my mind. But right now I'm playing with the idea of looking at catastrophes, disasters, and we would call them emergency situations, 911 situations throughout history, and how people in the past were able to deal with that. So in the same way I told you the Xenophon story with the Assyrian ghost city, there's a wonderful account by Pliny the Elder, I think, or maybe it's Pliny the Younger, about the eruption of Vesuvius once, and how the Romans basically had to evacuate an island and all these kinds of things. In other words, trying to do what would be a very big task for modern people today with only what they had at hand in ancient times. So I was thinking about going and finding 5, 6, 10 examples from history about how peoples in the past handled great fires or tsunamis or earthquakes, or, what's the rescue squad? How do they treat the injured? What do they do? And and so that would be more of what we call one of our Blitz edition shows, which I think the Red Scare one was also.
Yeah, that was a blue. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So those were supposed to be shorter shows, and instead they've just turned into sort of a different focus. And so rather than focusing on World War I or the Mongol conquest, this will focus on sort of, isn't it interesting? There'll be less drama and more. Isn't it interesting? We call them Twilight Zone twists. There'll be more of those and less narration, maybe. Certainly a whole lot less reading material for me, I think.
Yeah, you deserve the break, man.
Well, listen, my wife is I got to move. I don't have any place for the books anymore.
I can only imagine how that has to look like. Yeah.
I have to say, in the United States, you get to write off business expenses, and one of the really great side benefits of being a history podcaster is all these history books are a tax write-off. So I'm building a nice library for business, and it's one of the few things I can actually deduct from my taxes.
Nice.
Awesome.
Dan, well, I'm sure, after talking to you, the listeners we have in Slovenia and maybe around the world, but especially in Slovenia, are gonna, definitely tune in and check out your podcast. I see your podcast, especially the hardcore history, popping up in Slovenian iTunes in the popular section. So that's good to see. And I actually talked to a couple of my friends who have mentioned it. And when we started doing this podcast about a year and a half ago, they were all like, "Oh, you got to get Dan Carlin on. We got to talk to this guy. You got to talk to this guy." So truly appreciate you taking your time and talking to us. This has been awesome.
Please tell your Slovenian listeners, that if they feel they got slighted in the World War I history, that there's just one of about 50 different people that did. So my apologies to. I even, what's funny? I went out of my way, for example, to talk about, for example, the Australians, and I still got a note from somebody that says, "Well, I wish you would have said it was this particular Australian division that did it." You can't win. I'm sure somebody from Italy would say, "My gosh, you talked more about the Australians than you did the Italians." So there's no way to win in that situation.
Yeah, you basically just have to stop apologizing. That's pretty
anyway,
much.
You guys have been very kind to me. I hope your listeners enjoy what we did.
Yeah,
thank you, friends.
Then, by the way, Daniele Bolele said hello. I just talked to him. I was texting him with him back and forth before we started. He's. I
love Daniele Bolele.
Yeah, I'll call him my friend. We talk a lot. We have never met, but we talked a lot. Texting back and forth. He was on our show a couple of episodes ago, and we kind of kept in touch. So by the way, he said hi. I just talked to him like an hour ago.
I'm having lunch with him next week.
I know. He told me. I know. So you guys have fun.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, maybe we could just tell the fans hardcorehistory.com is where people can find everything about the podcast.
I think it's at dancarlin.com.
dancarlin.com. That's right, dancarlin.com. That's where everything is. People tune in, check out the podcast. Both of them, they're both great.
Don't sabotage my Wikipedia page.
I think somebody warned you on Twitter when you were complaining like it's gonna get worse now. I think you can probably expect that. Yeah,
not the first time I've done something stupid like that.
Yeah, don't mess with the internet, Dan. That's
no. The internet is my friend.
Anything else? Anything else we should mention at the end of the podcast?
That's pretty much it. Like the show is on the detailspodcast.com. We're also in iTunes, so you can leave a review there. That'd be awesome because then more people can find the show. And then your Twitter account. You should.
Okay. Well, at Hardcore History is one, and at DC Common Sense is the other. And I appreciate that, guys.
All right. That's pretty much it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm at Bokin Akbar on Twitter, and Anje.
I'm at Atomic XX. That's the English account. Anyway, that's a running joke. Anyway, Dan, thank you so much for doing this, man. This is awesome.
Anytime. You guys stay in touch, please.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. To je bil pogovor z Danom Carlinom. Upam, da ste toliko uživali kot mi z Anžetom. Zanimiv človek, ki ima res ta zanimiv podcast Hardcore History. Še enkrat bom vse povabil na dancarlin oziroma carlin.com in si dajte to pogledati. Res ne bom žal. Anže, adni zadeve?
Podcast najdete na aparatus.si. Smo tudi v iTunesih, tako da če ste tam kakšno ceno, je fajn, ker nas tako še kdo najde, tako da ful hvala. Zdaj so že, mislim, da kar konkretno, čez 100, konkretno, 110 ali neki. Drugač pa sužen strokovnjak, dela neutrudno, čeprav je utrujen, ampak ga silimo na Twitter accountu podrobnosti počrtaj si.
Jaz se upam, da ne bo kdo se je najdel, ki bo rekel, da smo full derogatory, veš.
Zakaj? Saj sužen, si lahko nasran do njega, glavno. Zdaj bom pa točno takoj potem rekel in mrežo aparatus lahko tudi podprete.
Ja, se ti bolj pa še skupaj, veš.
aparatus.si/podpri. Obljubimo, da nič denarja ne bo šlo za sužnja, ker je pač sužen. To je to je kar se admina tiče. Boki, kje se tebe najde na internetu?
@bokinakbar oziroma @bokinakbar na Twitterju, to je to.
Odlično, jaz sem pa na Twitterju @afnanzet, tako da nam tam tešte, pa ful hvala vsem, ki delite, ko objavimo epizodo. To je do naslednjič to, tako da reče dio.
Sem nekaj, da bi še vprašal na hitro.
Vprašaj.
Čak, a posnel si, pol nisi Blaža zdaj, izdeževalca? Blažo zdaj gledati, veš?
Poslovne skrivnosti. V glavnem...
Zikr si.
Reče dio.
Fan number one. Ti imaš prav dobro kombinacijo, Roxette pa vedeževalc Blaž, to je tvoj...
Hvala, CV si nabiral.
Go to. Ajde. Se slišimo naslednjič. Ajde, čau.
Čau.